I've always had a passionate interest in Abdu'l-Baha's secular life. So we all know, don't we, what a tremendous spiritual life he led, and how authoritative and how important he is in religious terms. This turns the other way. It doesn't ignore it, but it looks very much at his career, if you like, as a career builder, as a community builder, his secular life. So that's where we're going today. The larger part of this presentation will probably be taken up by the slides not moving as fast as they should. So again, you can look up this yourself, but in the Tablets of the World back in 1891, Baha'u'llah wrote this quote that you can see here. I'm just going to move my gallery of shots out of the way so I can actually see it myself. So there you go. He said, that which is conducive to the advancement of mankind and to the reconstruction of the world. This is what he was outlining in that tablet. And you can see 4 of the main elements that he identified, the guiding principles. And the 4th one is agricultural development. And that's what we're going to start with, because Abdu'l-Baha had a tremendous career and great success as an agri-entrepreneur, if I might put it that way. Again, here you can see a couple of quotes. Baha'u'llah said that there was special regard had to be paid to agriculture, as unquestionably it precedes the other principles. Those 4 you saw on the previous slide, the most important is agriculture. And also identified work on the land as identical to worship. And you can see there then what Abdu'l-Baha had to say about it. A lot of things, but these 2 are important, that he regarded the fundamental basis of any community as being agriculture, and the farmer being a primary factor in the body politic. In other words, the way we organize society, the farmer was at the very fundamental base of that. And I've just got an illustration there of some of the activities that we are used to in terms of the economic activity of the world. But we have to remember that the vast majority of the world still works off the land. That's most important. So we have a very Western aspect on what the world economy looks like, but for most people, it's working on the land. And usually in very, very small farms at that. So just on the concepts side a little bit more, Abdu'l-Baha made these 2 remarks. They can be found, I can source all these quotes for you, that the transformation of economic systems, this is Abdu'l-Baha, must commence with the farmer and then be extended to the other classes. So again, this is echoing what his father said, that agriculture and the farmer are at the root of everything, the way you organize society. And he also said that the solution to economic problems begins with the village. And when the village is reconstructed, then the cities will be also. This also goes back to the idea you saw earlier on an earlier slide, that really agriculture can be seen in some ways as a natural way of life, the norm, and cities and civilization that goes with them is actually a construct. So it's really emphasizing that working on the land is the most fundamental thing. So agri-entrepreneur is not a made-up Stephen term. It is a real term. Abdu'l-Baha bought this piece of land. You can see the size of it. So it's about 3.5 square miles. And it was chopped up into 24 parts, which was common in those days. This was the days when the land where they were was under Ottoman control, Turkish control. And at first it didn't work very well, and he had to start over again. And interestingly, he did so by bringing in talented farmers from Madiyabad near Yazd in central Persia. So he actually transplanted farmers from a very long way, very brave thing for them to do. And they came in successive waves. You can see on the last bullet point there, the subsection, that they came in successive waves right up to and including in the First World War. The next slide, if you can follow it, this is where it is. So Al-Adasiyyah was the main site. There was 2 or 3 others as well, but this was the main one, and it's the one that survived longest. And this is in the Gore of Jordan Valley. So it's in modern Jordan. So you can see the blue spot. If you can see my cursor, there it is. This red balloon is absolutely nothing to do with it at all. It just shows it's a sea, Sea of Galilee. But this is where Al-Adasiyyah is. It's now in modern Jordan. At that time, it was part of the wider area, all under the control of the Turks. Abdu'l-Baha was a great innovator in terms of agriculture. He had a light hand because he used to give people guidance, ask them questions, take their answers, interpret and advise. But he was not a heavy-handed owner of the land. he had a very fair attitude too. Landlords in those days who owned land could charge quite large high rents, and you can see in the middle section here that Abdu'l-Baha not only didn't tax his tenants harshly, but he also reduced the share that they took after the First World War, when times were harder, and rather than simply say, well, I'm the landlord, these are the terms you agreed to, that's that, he actually relaxed those terms, which was extremely unusual. There was a high mixture of education in all of the agricultural policies that Abdu'l-Baha advocated. So, for example, he urged the farming families who come from Persia to learn Arabic and English, the lingua franca of the area where they took up residence. This is one of those dense slides that I'm really not going to read, but the point of it really is to just illustrate that they had to clear this land by tool, with hand tools. It was all scrub, really tough land to clear. And they dug wells and so on, surface wells, so not deep wells. You can see that crop rotation was practiced. That was really innovative in that area. It was unknown. It had been known in the West, in the UK in particular, for 200 years. It was not known in this part of the world, and was an introduction. And you can see the immense variety of produce. Some of that was for home consumption. It would be usually the fruits, because those were good, obviously, for their own diet, for the families. But most of the stuff they produced was sold on the market. And they also had livestock, and you can see there the range. I've never known people in the UK to keep pigeons for livestock, but normally for entertainment and racing and so forth, but they kept them there. So a real mixture of cereal produce, fruit, vegetables, and keeping animals on the land. Abdu'l-Baha's entrepreneurship was also extended into things like irrigation. So it wasn't just basic farming practice, but it was things like introducing banana shoots from India, which became extremely popular in the area, making sure the irrigation was sorted out so that if dams were required, then that can be funded. He knew things about plants and trees which have become much more common these days. So, for example, how quinine can be taken from eucalyptus. One of the things he did was to encourage the farmers to actually export elsewhere. So they didn't just sell down the road in the local villages, but he had them taking their produce to Akka, to Haifa, and then what is now modern Syria, Tiberias and Damascus, because he knew that the higher prices could be gained in those wider markets. This is an extremely early example, but a good one, of him urging people to move beyond their traditional horizons and parameters. This isn't a talk that has much time for economic philosophy, but this is a bit of it. So this is from Star of the West, which was published in the United States for about, well, several decades, but certainly it was active in this time. So you can see here it says that no religious books of the past prophets speak of the economic question, while this problem has been thoroughly solved in the teachings of Baha'u'llah. Certain regulations are revealed which ensure the welfare and well-being of all humanity. And this goes on in the next slide. Won't read the rest of it. It's in the same vein. But the next one talks about how, skip to the right one, how this is actually interpreted in practical terms, and this is where it matters. So Abdu'l-Baha advocated grassroots government, so that in each village there should be a board who should organize themselves, and this should be the welfare of the community as a whole. This wouldn't just be for Baha'is, this would be for the whole community. Bearing in mind, these farmers in Al-Adasiyyah were living in a very mixed area. They were the minority, very small minority. So equally, he advocated having a storehouse, which is like a kind of reserve or a safety net. So now we're beginning to think almost in terms of the modern welfare system. He went further because we know from records that wealth was identified in these terms. You can see voluntary contributions or philanthropy, but most importantly, there were tithes and taxes on animals. The tithes are really interesting because the way Abdu'l-Baha approached tithes was very much like a modern income tax. So if we go to the next slide, you will see he actually wrote this down in great detail. So he was discursive, but I've actually put it into a table to make it more intelligible, especially in the time we have. But you can see this is graduated income tax. So if someone's income was low, they wouldn't have to, or very low, they wouldn't have to pay any tax at all. But the wealthier they were, in terms of their disposable income, the more tax they were expected to pay. if you ended up with people who met misfortune, so their income and their expenses were completely out of whack, the last example there, well, what happened was that there was a welfare system. So Abdu'l-Baha said, on the other hand, having given his discourse about how people should be taxed, he says, on the other hand, a person's income may be $200, but his needs absolutely essential for his livelihood are $500. Provided he has not failed in effort and exertion, or his farm has not been blessed with a harvest, such a one must be helped from the general storehouse, so that he may not remain in need and may live in ease. So this is another philosophy, the economic philosophy, that people were expected to make an effort and to work and not to idle. But if misfortune hit them, illness, bad trading, maybe poor judgment on what they were growing, they weren't to be cast aside. They were to be
14 Teilnehmer sind da nur.
Sorry?
Ja, klar.
Okay, I think someone has their mic on. Could you perhaps mute, please? That
yeah,
would be...
I think I've just, killed it.
And the reason a lot of this endeavor was so important in Abdu'l-Baha's secular life was it became recognized. He was regarded by many people as being an extremely good businessman and very wise. And this section now is going to show you how he came to be commended by the British government with a knighthood. So in 1915, just up the road from Haifa, in the Mount Lebanon area, there was a very, very severe famine. And you can see here some of the facts. I do apologize for this picture of people in distress. It's not a picture I like to show. We don't have their permission. They've long gone. But I would like to think that they know that we were recognizing the suffering they had to undergo. Because of the success of the farming area around Al-Adasiyyah and elsewhere, Abdu'l-Baha was able to come to the rescue of Haifa and Akka and relieve the famine. And he did it with this train of 200 camels, which went back and forth between the farming areas and the cities that needed to be relieved. And that actually broke the famine and prevented the kind of terrible suffering in Haifa and Akka that unfortunately the folks in Lebanon had to put up with.
And Stephen,
and that led him
closing comment, that'd be fantastic. This is fascinating.
Here you can see this is just a record of the number of camels and the sacks of grain that were tripped back and forth to relieve the famine. And the fact that Abdu'l-Baha did this, sorry, I'm just going to get back to this one. The fact that Abdu'l-Baha did this was recognized by the government. So in the time that Abdu'l-Baha was active in 1916 to 18, the British authorities were in charge then on the Palestine Protectorate, and they recognized what he'd done as a humanitarian. So they gave him a knighthood, which he accepted. And I'm just going to skip this is the description of what he'd done for the British authorities, how they rewarded him. But the really interesting thing is the last slide, where as a British civic advisor in the area at the time recorded that Abdu'l-Baha's comment on the knighthood was, as it comes from the British government, I accept it. As a teacher of God's word, it makes no difference to me. So that was his own perspective on that award. And I'd like to know how many seconds I overshot. Thank you.
Fantastic, fascinating, and you managed it. And there's so much more to capture within the lines of what you said. Already a few questions are popping in, but really insightful, really interesting, this wider sense of how you treat people. And I think that can extend how the company, the principles of any company, and the focus on agriculture, the development of your human beings there, the justice in which you divide the wealth. There's so much to tap into. So let's see, Kaihan has a first question for you. Kaihan, would you like to voice it?
So, certainly. I think the focus on the village is very interesting, and community building, of course, now is a focus for the Baha'is. And, I'm just, the world is so driven by an idea of globalization. I think a lot of business people today would probably laugh at this idea on the basis that the further industrialization of food production is the answer to the world's sort of food shortage problems and so on. And the idea of focusing on the village seems to run kind of counter. So I'm just, is anything that you have studied in this, does it give you the impression of Abdu'l-Baha's perspective on globalization?
Well, certainly programs or movements such as the community-supported agriculture, which is becoming more and more common in many Western economies as well as elsewhere. That lends very much to the idea of looking at villages either individually or as groups in an area. So the work we do in Malawi is about 60 villages, adding up to about 20,000 people. But so you can take the view that groups of villages would work probably just as well because they can help each other in different because they have different skill levels. But nonetheless, it's still having things organised from the agricultural base upwards. So I think it does apply in the modern world. We're just calling it something a little bit different. So CSA, the community supported agriculture, is one aspect. But there are people like George Monbiot who've done a great deal of work to show that actually non-industrialized agriculture is more efficient. There are people who will say, there's a guy who's an expert in the CSA world who says, quite frankly, and he's been at it a long time, he's a well-respected expert. If you see the Tomorrow film, he's featured in that. And he says that basically agribusinesses are good at making money, but are not very good at producing good food. And so it's quality that people are looking for, maybe more than the profit.
Yeah, sorry, just to be clear, I wasn't in any way attacking the position. I'm sorry if that sort of came across. It was just to sort of try and stress the sort of the reason for the question, I suppose, which is understanding the perspective on, you know, do we feel that Abdu'l-Baha was supportive of global capitalism, global industrialization in the way that we know it today, or you know, do we think that his focus on the village implies that that he would see a balance, the shift towards the local and away from the global?
I think Mahmoud may have a contribution which would help more than I can. I mean, I think with everything I've ever studied with the Baha'i writings, including right through to the Universal House of Justice letters and communications, it's always a question of setting the principles, and then the actual practice has to be evolved and discussed from there. So there's no way that I, or perhaps anybody else, should extrapolate what Abdu'l-Baha did and make assumptions in a different environment. You have to go back to the principles, and it's up to us to decide where they take us. I think CSA is a natural follow on from what Abdu'l-Baha does, but I wouldn't go any further than that. Is it okay to bring in Mahmoud?
Absolutely, and to confirm that, or maybe add to it, I think in the writings very often it is not a question of either or, it's the question of both. In the Century of Light that I think you just quoted, there is the passage where Abdu'l-Baha writes to people in a village, I think it is Kesh, if I'm not mistaken, in Iran, a village that had no contact with the external world, and told them that their view should be world embracing. So we have examples in all directions, not both, but in all directions. So again, what Stephen said is, it is up to us to take all those vast or all those many perspectives and make something out of it for a specific case. Maybe a certain type of agriculture, but anyhow, globalization in itself also is a word that has been used for everything and anything. So again, back to Stephen, we have to bring the principles and then see what we do with the principles. Thank you. I
was asked in another rendition of this talk whether Abdu'l-Baha and by extension Baha'u'llah were capitalists or socialists. And I said both, neither. These are completely irrelevant labels. They transcend that kind of narrow concept. I think this is the time for questions.
Because I had a point about the small, big, whatever, but the implications of the boards looking after, knowing the status of the people around them has an element of closeness. So it may be a huge place, but you're aware of the status of people. I think that level of awareness.
Terms, that's subsidiarity. We're used to this idea that things should be done best at the lowest level, and if it can't be done at that level, you go up one, but you try and do everything at the most close level.
I think that's exactly this closeness, this element of knowledge, of closeness, of feeling that somebody's looking after you, that you are looking after others. That's one of the strong elements of community building within a justice framework. And that would imply, just like in the LSA system and so forth, that there is a localization. There can be a global vision and principles, but then a localization that really gets to know and connects people, and then interconnecting, just like your life, Steve, and just say, Wales, UK, Malawi, Canada. So we're not restricted globally, but the activities are still local and connecting with each other. So that could be a way to.
And the principles apply everywhere. The principles I've discussed, they apply everywhere.